welcome to Aussie Liberty. My name is Lee. Today I want to do a final follow-up. Well, probably not final forever, but final for this week. A follow-up to the previous two videos I've done on drug prohibition and how it doesn't work. I'll put the links up here if you haven't seen them. So the question I get once we get onto this subject, the question wants to sort of go over the economics of prohibition, go over the political consequences and all the negative impacts that drug prohibition has. Once I get to that point, people say, well, yeah, what about drug abusers? And I say, okay, let's talk about them. Let's talk about how prohibition hurts drug users. So first thing to note, not everybody who uses drugs is a drug abuser. Same as alcohol, same as, well, I guess smoking's not quite the same, but, when we think about alcohol, we draw a pretty distinct line between people who drink alcohol and people who are alcoholics. And even then, there's lots of people who are alcoholics and are functional. There are people out there who are dysfunctional alcoholics. But we usually sort of treat them differently from everybody else. And it's the same with every other type of drug, any type of recreational, mind-altering substance. There's a big difference between people who use drugs and people who abuse drugs, and people whose abuse of drugs is detrimental to them and to the people around them. So when we talk about the impacts of prohibition, we've got to remember that the law doesn't treat users any different from dysfunctional abusers. So if you get busted with a bit of weed and you just smoke it for fun on the weekends, you are threatened with prison just as much as anybody else. And the nature of prohibition means that you've got prisons full of people whose only crime is to, have a bit of fun on the weekends, or, and there's all sorts. In the US, you see situations where, college students, like university students, get caught up in this. They get busted with a bit of weed. The cops then get them to be a informant. And people have been murdered because they were basically pressured by cops to be informants. They've gone to do this, get involved in all this criminal conspiracy stuff that they have nothing to do with. Like, they are just like one end user, and they're getting, having to go buy kilos of stuff, and they get found out to be an informant, and then they're murdered. Like, the reality of drug prohibition is it treats all users and abusers as the same, which it really shouldn't. So secondly, you've got these people who abuse drugs. Okay, why do they abuse drugs? Well, it's not because drugs have some sort of mystical pull on their minds that they can somehow force them to be something else. Most drugs, like if you look at the research, particularly a guy called Dr. Carl Hart, he's realized that most of what we know about drugs is wrong in terms of addiction. That people get addicted essentially because they have personal problems, or they have a personal inclination that drives them to this sort of behavior. The drugs themselves are not inherently addictive. So people talk about how heroin is so addictive. Well, yeah. Firstly, alcohol withdrawals are more dangerous than heroin withdrawals, and secondly, the number of people who actually try a drug and then go on to abuse it is still a very small number, like fraction of percent in terms of things like heroin. So you've got this situation where, like, you need to sort of get the right analysis that the reason people abuse drugs is because they have problems in their lives they can't solve or don't feel they can solve normally, in the normal sorts of ways. They turn to drugs and it ruined their relationships and, all the consequences of that. Now, the way you help those people is not by putting them in prison. Like, if you're having troubles holding out a job, holding out relationships, the last place you should be going is prison, where you can't have contact with anybody in your life, where you can't get a job afterwards because you've got a criminal record, where you're spending your time with criminals and being drawn into a criminal world and forming alliances with criminals because you've got to survive in prison, and stopping, so there's the last place people should be going if they've got drug problems is prison. Now, you could say, well, let's make them go to mandatory drug treatment. Well, it's better than sending them to prison. But the thing is, if you've got people who, recreationally use it and have no problems, and they repeatedly get busted, eventually you go to prison. Or if you don't turn up to your treatment, you go to prison. So drug courts are better. I won't deny that. But really, legalization is the best way to go forward, because it actually if you legalize it, you also make it easier. Thirdly, I guess you make it easier for drug abusers to get help because they can go to people and say, look, I've got this problem. Can you help me? If they go, there's a huge problem where people who have overdoses in the street, and then people never call the ambulance because they're worried the cops are going to bust them. Well, there's all these sorts of incentives that come through that make it difficult for drug abusers to get help when they need it. So really, if you want to help drug abusers, if your goal is to help drug abusers, dysfunctional drug abusers, don't send them to prison. Make drugs legal, make them safe to use, enable them so they can get the help they need, so they can get their life back on track. Just as the same we treat alcoholics. We don't send alcoholics to prison unless they actually commit a crime. Being an alcoholic alone is not a crime. Neither should be a drug abuser. So thanks for joining me, and I'll have more videos up next week.